President Donald Trump announces Judge Brett Kavanaugh is his nominee to replace Justice Anthony Kennedy on the Supreme Court. The 53-year-old has spent over a decade as a judge on the U.S. Court of Appeals for the D.C. Circuit. He previously worked in the White House during the George W. Bush administration. Kavanaugh is a devout Catholic and serves as a lector at a D.C. church. He volunteers with Catholic charities and tutors students at the Washington Jesuit Academy. The Supreme Court nominee is married with 2 daughters. On Tuesday, Kavanaugh met with Republican leaders on Capitol Hill as the Senate battle begins over his nomination. The GOP has a slim 51-49 majority in the Senate. For a reaction, we go to Richard Garnett, a professor of law and concurrent professor of political science at the University of Notre Dame's Law School. He joins us from Notre Dame's campus in South Bend, Indiana. Professor, thank you for your time.
Oh, it's my pleasure. Thank you.
First off, what is your reaction to Judge Brett Kavanaugh's nomination to the Supreme Court?
It's entirely understandable that he would have been on any Republican president's short list. His reputation is excellent. He's known to be a very careful judge, really whip-smart intellect, great writer. So I think the president made a very good choice, and I suspect that he'll impress everybody who comes into contact with him and everybody who gets a chance to observe him.
There is a lot of talk right now about overturning Roe v. Wade. Can you walk us through what steps are necessary for that to happen?
Sure. So the first thing to remember is just that Roe versus Wade itself was substantially modified in the early 90s in a case called Planned Parenthood versus Casey. And that's really the law of the land now with respect to the regulation of abortion. Now, the justices, they're not in the business of just announcing that this or that case is overruled. They wait for cases to come to them. So in order for Casey to be modified or even overruled, what would have to happen would be that there's a case that works its way up through the lower federal courts or perhaps the state courts. Then lower courts issue a ruling on the validity of a particular regulation, and then that case eventually finds its way to the Supreme Court. That could take some time. The justices don't have the ability just to seek out precedents that they'd like to overrule. This is going to be a process that depends on litigation and on cases moving their way through the courts. Then by the time a case actually gets to the Supreme Court, the justices might not feel that they need to overrule a precedent in order to decide a particular case, whether to uphold the regulation or to strike it down. But there could come a time, and there are some cases in the pipeline right now, where the justices will be confronted with the question, should the Roe and Casey decisions stand, or should they be abandoned on the ground that they were wrongly decided and that there are no sufficient justifications for keeping them on the books?
Thank you for clarity on that. And last week, the U.S. bishops wrote a letter to the Senate urging them not to use support for Roe v. Wade as a litmus test for the judicial nominees, as though, quote, nominees who oppose the purposeful taking of innocent human life are somehow unfit for judicial office in the United States. Professor, how do you foresee the Roe v. Wade question playing out in the confirmation hearings?
Yeah, so for the last 30 years or so, in all of these confirmation hearings, there's been this kind of performance where the senators will try to get nominees to promise that they will either overrule or that they will preserve the Roe precedent. And not surprisingly, judges who are up for consideration to be justices don't want to make those kind of promises. So every nominee says pretty much the same thing, which is that currently Roe and Casey are the law of the land. And they also say that precedent is important and stability in the law is important. And then they also say that in any particular case, they would have an open mind about whether or not that precedent should be retained or should be discarded. And some of the senators will be frustrated with these answers because, again, they're trying to get something a little juicier. But every nominee, whether it's by a Democratic president or a Republican president, is going to say precedent's important, but I'll keep an open mind when the time comes. Now, I think what the bishops were getting at is very important, though, because it should not be the case that somebody who's well qualified and intelligent and well trained is somehow blocked from consideration for serving on the high court simply because he or she won't promise that they're committed to abortion rights. We wouldn't want that in a judge, it seems to me. We should want judges who are, again, talented and able and open-minded regardless of what their religious backgrounds might be, or regardless of what their personal beliefs on the question of abortion might be. At the end of the day, it's a legal question. Does the Constitution allow the people to choose to regulate abortion because they believe that it's immoral?
And finally, you are open about the fact that Amy Coney Barrett, who is also a top contender to be a Supreme Court nominee, is not only your colleague, but your friend, neighbor, and a godmother to one of your daughters. She faced direct hostility for her Catholic faith during her appellate court confirmation. What do you think Kavanaugh could learn from the way Coney Barrett responded to those attacks?
Well, you're right. Judge Amy Coney Barrett is an amazing person, and I thought she handled that situation with a great deal of grace. The questioning by some of the senators was very clumsy and in some cases offensive. I suspect that the senators might have learned a little bit of a lesson and that they'll be more careful. They'll be sure not to misrepresent Judge Kavanaugh's writings, which is what happened in Judge Barrett's situation. And I think they'll be cautious, and they'll make sure that none of their questioning suggests that somehow Catholic nominees should come in for extra scrutiny or suspicion. At the same time, Judge Kavanaugh has been very open about his Catholic faith and his participation in the Catholic community in D.C., and I gather he even coaches CYO basketball, which is important. And it's perfectly appropriate for senators to ask him and to expect him to say that he'll follow the law and that he won't use his position to impose his own personal preferences. But hopefully we're well past the place where there's a kind of heightened scrutiny of nominees simply because they're Catholic.
Richard Garnett, professor of law and concurrent professor of political science at the University of Notre Dame's Law School. Thank you so much for your time.
It's my pleasure. Thank you.
We continue our analysis now in studio with Mallory Quigley, the Vice President of Communications for the Susan B. Anthony List. Mallory, it's always good to see you.
Good to see you too, Catherine.
Thanks for being here. Now, your group, the Susan B. Anthony List, has been lobbying for a Supreme Court nominee who believes in the Constitution and the right to life. Is Brett Kavanaugh that nominee?
Absolutely. I think that this is a great week for pro-life Americans and for those of us that respect and admire the Constitution and want to see justices placed on the court who are going to look at that document as the founders intended and are going to interpret it, looking at the right to life for all Americans born and unborn.
What do we know about Supreme Court nominee Kavanaugh's previous rulings when it came to the life issue?
Well, he has been on the D.C. Circuit Court for a number of years, so there's a bit of a paper trail, which is always good to have. There has been a bit of a controversy on one ruling in the Garza case. It was a recent case involving the ACLU suing the federal government, trying to force the Trump administration to facilitate abortions for young girls, immigrant girls that are here illegally. And so it's been a little bit difficult for even me to understand some of the criticism in this case because Judge Kavanaugh did side with the Trump administration and said the federal government should not be forced to facilitate these abortions. They agreed with the Trump administration that the government has an interest in protecting fetal life, in protecting the best interests of a minor child, and also in not facilitating abortions. The controversy has to do with the fact that Judge Kavanaugh did not sign on to another dissenting opinion by another judge who argued that indeed illegal immigrants do not have constitutional rights to abortion because they don't have any constitutional rights. This is different people with different legal philosophies can disagree, I think, on this point. But the bottom line is that Judge Kavanaugh agreed with the Trump administration and argued the same point that they made.
Also this week, the Susan B. Anthony List released a new poll. What does it tell us about American attitudes towards abortion?
Right. Well, Catherine, I think since Justice Kennedy announced that he was retiring, the pro-abortion lobby has been shouting to the rooftops about Roe versus Wade and how Americans support Roe versus Wade. But the thing about it is that when you ask Americans whether or not they support Roe versus Wade, you're going to get a million different answers for a million different people because everyone sort of puts their own viewpoint on abortion on that decision. The reality is that Roe versus Wade opened up the floodgates for abortion on demand in this country. The United States, as you and the viewers know, is only one of 7 countries in the whole world to allow elective abortion after 5 months. It's very extreme. So the poll that we did this week is we asked Americans, particularly those in battleground states where this is going to be a big issue because their senators are pressure points for the vote on this nomination. And we asked them, do you think that abortion policies should be decided by the people via their elected representatives in the state legislatures or by the Supreme Court? And overwhelmingly what we found is that they agree that abortion policy should be decided in the states. And frankly, that's what would happen if Roe versus Wade were to be overturned, which we don't know when that would happen, but that's the most likely scenario, is that this is going to be sent back to the states for us to hash out the disagreements over abortion and find where is that clarity, where is that common ground. And as you know, we think that certainly there is common ground right now at a consensus point of 5 months, limiting abortion after that point, and we'll continue to build consensus until every life is protected.
Finally, Mallory, what is the Susan B. Anthony list going to do to really put the pressure on the Senate to confirm Kavanaugh?
Right now, what we're doing this week, we had 3 press conferences in West Virginia, Indiana, and North Dakota, 3 places where those senators, Donnelly, Heitkamp, and Manchin, they all voted for Justice Gorsuch. So there's a real chance that they could vote to confirm this nominee, but they have to hear from their constituents. And certainly across the nation, senators are going to need to hear from their pro-life constituents telling them to confirm this nominee.
Mallory Quigley, thank you so much for being here and for clarifying all these questions we had.
Absolutely, my pleasure.